Well, today, an ordinary American girl from an ordinary American family brought down a British prince with her truth and extraordinary courage. That is the first sentence of a statement released by the family of a woman who accused the man who the British until today called Prince Andrew of her when she was 17 years old. The British press and the press around the world is reporting tonight what the New York Times calls, quote, an extraordinary punishment that man named Andrew has now suffered at the hands of his brother, who is the current claimant of the title King of England. His older brother, a so-called king, had already taken his house away on the palace grounds and banished him to his still royal country house. And today, finally, the absurd title has been removed. The extraordinary punishment the New York Times is referring to is that Andrew will no longer be called a prince, and, quote, will now be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. And while we're on the subject, Windsor is a fake name too. Windsor is an invented name used to mask the German heritage of the people who have been claiming the position of royal family in Britain for the entire 20th and 21st century. In 1917, in the middle of the First World War, with England fighting against Germany, the so-called British royal family decided to mask their German background by plucking from out of nowhere the classically English-sounding name Windsor and suddenly claiming it as their own. The truth is a name change is not punishment. If you offered Jeffrey Epstein the option of being arrested and sent to prison as a child rapist or having to change his name, which do you think he would have chosen? And so now the big punishment for Andrew is that no one in Britain will call him the Duke of York or His Royal Highness, which no sane person anywhere ever should have called him? None of those preposterous descriptors of that human being have ever been allowed on this program. He had his titles removed from him on this program on the first mention of his disgraced name here. Nothing changed today. There was no new evidence for Andrew's older brother to suddenly react today, but the weight of Jeffrey Epstein's legacy forced the King of England to symbolically and only symbolically distance himself from his deeply Epstein-involved little brother. The manipulative so-called king wants it both ways. He wants to suggest that there's a possibility that his little brother did not rape Virginia Giuffre, as she claimed. And so the statement issued by the king's press release writers said, these censures are deemed necessary, notwithstanding the fact that he continues to deny the allegations against him. And then the king's writers tell this lie about the rest of the family, saying their majesties wish to make clear that their thoughts and utmost sympathies have been and will remain with the victims and survivors of any and all forms of abuse. Okay, then give them the houses on your country estates. You just gave your accused rapist little brother another country house on your family's estates to live in for free for the rest of his life, and you claim that your utmost sympathies are not with your little brother, the accused rapist, but your utmost sympathies are with, quote, the victims and survivors of any and all forms of abuse. Do you mean any and all forms of abuse visited upon people around the world by the British Crown throughout its ugly history? Or do you just mean the survivors of any and all forms of abuse delivered directly to them by individual members of your family? The New York Times points out today that Charles and his little brother have done quite a job on that whole concept of British support of a monarchy during their public lifetimes. In 2023, a poll of British social attitudes by the National Center for Social Research found that 54% of people surveyed said that it was very or quite important for Britain to have a monarchy, compared with 86% in 1983. That 86% support of a monarchy was in the second year of Charles' first marriage to Diana, which ended miserably and helped drive support of the monarchy down every day, with Andrew then bursting into public view much later to drag it down into the mud from which we can hope it then sinks and disappears. The difference between the Charles who calls himself a king and the Donald who wants to be one is that Donald Trump does not care what comes after him. Charles wants the monarchy to live forever. Donald Trump knows that he cannot live forever. Donald Trump knows that his presidency cannot live forever. So Donald Trump knows that all he has to do is keep the Epstein files secret for the next 3.5 years. And the intensity of Donald Trump's apparent need to keep the Epstein files secret becomes more vivid every day, especially with every new day of the government shutdown. Congressman Robert Garcia is a leader of the Democrats who have joined with some Republicans in the House of Representatives who are trying to have the Epstein files released. And he now sees the government shutdown as being as much or more about the Epstein files as it is about the federal budget.
It's criminal. It's outrageous that we have a duly elected member certified. The election's been certified by her own state. There's over 800,000 people in the state of Arizona with no representation in the Congress because Mike Johnson is afraid of the Epstein files and is currently right now playing cover up for Donald Trump and the White House. This idea that we now have a shutdown because they're too scared of the truth, they're too scared of getting justice for the survivors of women and girls that have been trafficked, as we know, in the past by Jeffrey Epstein and other powerful men. And so this shutdown has become, I think, really emblematic.
That I am king. That's why I wanted the military parade that nobody came to. That's why in the middle of a government shutdown and people losing snap, I'm going to spend $300 million on a ballroom because I am king. And that's what we're looking at. And the sickness of it is that the citizens are paying for themselves being the victims of this kind of delusional power.
Yeah, these are your tax dollars. I wonder about whether you call it existential, that's a nice word, or absurdly hypocritical premise of all this for Trump. Because they say it's an emergency. They say it's a rebellion. They say it's unrest. But if it were any of those things, why don't we see that? Why isn't there evidence of that? And in the case of D.C., as emphasized, it can't just be an emergency forever, unending into next year. If you go to D.C., and you and I are there all the time, we got reports from there, they got a lot of soldiers around, but it's a pretty quiet, peaceful streets.
And when you look at the fact, take D.C., for example, when I've been in and out of there, they're mostly in Georgetown and in other areas that there's not only high crime, there's not a lot of, quote, illegal people there. So what emergency? When did the emergency start? Where does it end? And how do you gauge the emergency? Oh, but we're really not there for an emergency. It's all kinds of window dressing. And again, it's to play to his ego that he's a military ruler and that he is in charge. And it's also to try and assuage the public that they're doing something. Yeah. And I think that we really need to be more vocal about this. And taxpayers, particularly now when we're seeing shutdowns and SNAP money, I mean, we're seeing real problems.
Well, that goes to the protest, which is something you've done your whole life. Rachel's talked about the power of it. I've heard you say, do you want to be a thermometer or a thermostat? Right? Because you can change the temperature. And the Supreme Court and these courts, they have rules. But everyone's noticed that sometimes they look around and they're trying to get a sense of where the country is. And the court right now is blocking Chicago, and the Trump administration's not violating that. They're following that, and these troops have an obligation to follow that. But the Washington Post reports Supreme Court asked for more briefs on the Chicago deployment. The justices won't rule at least till mid-November, which leaves Trump's troop deployment blocked until they rule. Because
what's going to happen now is Trump is giving way too much power to Ghislaine Maxwell. And I'm not a fan of her, obviously, right? She's a monster. God damn, she's a monster, right? But, like, let's be clear. Trump's giving her all the power. when it comes to her testimony and what she's willing to say. Not only has he already given her a whole big piece of the pie by just letting her go to the much nicer prison, and we still don't know all the details about that. We talked about that yesterday, the day before. Democrats are still looking into that. He's basically making her the linchpin to everything, and that means she could screw him. It's possible. That's why I put question marks in the title, right? That she could change her mind at any moment and absolutely doom him because he's unwilling to actually release everything else. He's unwilling to say, release the files, which he can do. And Congress, he can tell his buddies in Congress to do it too. And then actually get truth out there. Because right now the narrative being pushed by Trump is that there's no list, nothing exists, and basically she's the only one that knows anything, and he's considering pardoning her. But what if he doesn't and she slips? What if she doesn't trust him and she slips on him and flips on him? We already know. We saw what happened to Prince Andrew. We already know that the idea that it was only Jeff and only Ghislaine is BS. And that they were friends with Trump and friends with the prince and friends with Bill Clinton and friends with billionaires and friends with, all these types of people. We know that. And so now the question comes, Donald, are you going to put your fate in the hands of a woman that's a monster and that was charged with perjury, and the only reason she wasn't convicted is because she already got locked up for the more serious charges? Or are you going to release the files, and if you're innocent, they'll exonerate you?